Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more amazing HFY stories. Hit the bell icon to get notified about our latest uploads. The Unseen Chains ***. Across the galaxy, the name Isara was whispered with a mixture of fear, awe, and trembling respect. Her reputation as a slave, a weapon, and a leader was known from the mining pits of Rebellious Prime to the luxury estates of the Adar Coalition. She was a weapon forged in the depths of oppression, a woman whose very name had become a symbol of defiance. No master had ever been able to keep her for long. Her escape was inevitable, her resistance unstoppable. Isara was one of many on the galactic slave markets, but unlike the others, she had a fire in her that couldn't be extinguished. She was unique in that she had been taken from her home planet, Vashtor, at the age of 10 and had spent most of her life in chains. Yet, by her 24th year, she was a legend. Every failed uprising, every slave revolt, and every slave rebellion had her fingerprints on them. And somehow she always managed to vanish just when the galaxy thought they had finally broken her. Her captors had learned the hard way she was not like other slaves. Her mind was as sharp as a blade, and her cunning was unmatched. She manipulated her chains as if they were mere trinkets, escaping from one cage only to be thrown into a more dangerous one, often escaping again before anyone could stop her. But that was before the human. Most races in the galaxy had learned to avoid human involvement, especially in the darker underworlds. The Adar Coalition, the Nalian Empire, and other advanced civilizations had dismissed humans as too primitive and frail to be a true threat. To them, humans were little more than a nuisance, curious, persistent, but easily swatted away. They were wrong, of course, as they would soon find out. It was on the outskirts of the border system, at the far reaches of the galaxy, that a single human, barely more than a teenager, came across Isara's latest attempt at escape. No one had expected the human to be able to track her, let alone find her in the twisting labyrinth of the galactic black market. But he did. His name was Elias Creed. Young, brash, and with a fire in his heart that made him different from the rest of his kind. A smuggler by trade, Elias had spent years moving between the edges of society, picking up jobs no one else wanted. He had heard stories of the rebel slave woman who could never be caught, the one who could never be broken. He had heard rumors that even the most powerful slave lords in the galaxy were afraid of her. When he had been offered the job to transport Isara across 3 systems to a new master, the price had been tempting. But when he first saw her, his plans had changed. He expected to see a broken, defeated woman, someone who had given in to her fate after years of abuse. What he saw instead was a woman whose eyes burned with unspoken fury. She didn't beg. She didn't plead. She didn't even speak. But there was something in her posture, the way she held herself, that made Elias feel as if he were staring into the eyes of a predator. He knew right away that this wasn't just any slave. It was clear from the moment their eyes met that she saw something in him too, something different. "You're not like the others," she said quietly, her voice a whisper, but it was filled with authority. "You think you can control me?" Elias paused, surprised at her words. He had expected her to lash out, to resist, but she did none of those things. She simply watched him, her expression unreadable. "I'm not here to control you," Elias replied, his voice steady though his heart raced. "I'm here to help you." The idea was as crazy as it was dangerous. In the galaxy, humans were often dismissed as weak, irrelevant. Elias was an exception. He had seen enough of the galaxy to understand its complexities, its ruthless power struggles. Yet he still believed in something few others did. He believed in the strength of individual will. And that was why he saw something in her. The shackles, the chains, the scarred body, these were the outward signs of her captivity. But it was the fire in her eyes, the defiance in her soul that spoke to him. There was more to her than just a victim. She was a warrior. And he was going to free her. The journey to the human transport ship wasn't easy. Isara had been surrounded by armed guards, each more than capable of putting down any attempt at rebellion. Elias had to use all his skills as a smuggler to get her out of the heavily guarded auction block. In the dark alleys of the space station, amidst flashing neon signs and the hum of low-class technology, he had made the trade. They were both now fugitives. As they made their way to the ship, the sound of Isara's chains clanking was a constant reminder of the life she had led, her servitude, her pain. Yet Elias couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration. There was a fire in her, a spark that no amount of physical chains could extinguish. "I will never bow to anyone," Isara muttered under her breath as they boarded the ship. "But I will go with you. For now." The price of freedom ***. The human transport ship was nothing like the luxury cruisers of the galaxy's elite. It was a battered, humble vessel, no larger than a merchant freighter, but its simplicity was its strength. Elias had chosen it because it didn't attract attention. Its dull gray hull blended seamlessly into the cluttered expanse of the border systems, where pirate ships, smugglers and exiles made their living. To the casual observer, it was just another aging hulk, too insignificant to notice. Elias hadn't intended to keep Isara for long. He was a smuggler, after all, and he had a reputation to maintain. But there was something about her, something that gnawed at him, that made him want to protect her, to offer her the chance to escape the chains that had defined her life. He knew it was dangerous. He knew it was foolish. He had no idea what he had gotten himself into. As the ship hummed through the cold void, Elias found himself stealing glances at Isara. She had retreated to the rear of the ship, sitting with her back against the wall, her arms crossed. Her chains were no longer visible, thanks to the plasma cutters Elias had used to free her from the restraints, but the scars of her past remained etched in her skin, faint, dark lines that spoke of a lifetime of suffering. She wasn't speaking to him and he didn't push her. He understood that trust wasn't something that could be earned quickly, especially not in her world. To her, freedom wasn't just an abstract concept. It was a fight. It was the only thing that had kept her alive all these years. Elias wasn't sure if she even knew how to live without it. "You'll want to keep your distance," she said abruptly, breaking the silence. Her voice was low, but there was an edge to it. "The Adar Coalition doesn't take kindly to anyone who interferes with their property." Elias glanced up from the navigational console, his brow furrowing in confusion. "The Adar?" he asked. "What do they have to do with you?" Isara's eyes flashed, the cold, calculating look she always carried. "The Adar Coalition owns most of the slave markets in this sector. I was one of their most valuable commodities." Elias didn't need to ask for clarification. He already knew enough about the Adar to understand how they operated, ruthless, calculating, and with a stranglehold on entire sectors of the galaxy. They had little tolerance for insubordination, and anyone who crossed them was eliminated without mercy. "I didn't think the Adar were into bargaining," Elias muttered, staring back at the stars ahead. He wasn't concerned about the Adar. The human smugglers of the border systems had been running circles around their so-called enforcers for years. What bothered him was the silent storm building inside Isara. Isara looked at him, her gaze like a knife slicing through the tension. "They don't. And I don't care what happens to me. But you're a human. And they don't like humans sticking their noses in their business. You'll pay the price for what you've done." Elias didn't flinch at the threat. He had heard worse in his time, especially from the criminals, pirates, and corrupt officials who populated the black markets he frequented. What made him pause, however, was the emptiness in her voice. It wasn't the warning of someone who feared death. It was the voice of someone who had accepted it as a constant companion. "I'm not afraid of them," Elias said, his tone firm. "And if they come after us, I'll deal with them." Isara studied him for a long moment, as if trying to read his thoughts, trying to figure out what he was really about. But Elias had learned long ago that trust was something you couldn't fake. He wasn't lying. He had never been afraid of a fight, and the Adar didn't scare him. What scared him was the thought that he might not be enough to protect her. Isara stood, her posture rigid. She walked across the small cargo hold, pausing before the viewport that looked out into the void. Her voice was softer now, though still laced with a tension that hadn't dissipated. "You don't understand. Freedom doesn't come without a price. I've had more than my share of freedom, and lost it. You think you're doing me a favor, but you're not. You've just signed your own death warrant." Elias leaned back against the console, folding his arms. "Maybe," he said quietly. "But I don't think you'll let them take us so easily." For a brief moment, he saw something in her eyes, a flicker of something that resembled hope. But it vanished before he could fully understand it. "You'll regret this," she warned. "The Adar won't rest until they have me back. And when they come for you, it won't be just your life on the line. They'll burn everything you've ever cared about to the ground." Elias didn't reply. He didn't have the words for it. He had been warned countless times by his fellow smugglers, by people who had seen the power of the Adar firsthand. Yet he refused to back down. There was something about her, something that made him believe in the possibility of more than just survival. In the quiet hum of the ship's engine, Elias and Isara were worlds apart, but both were on the same path. Elias couldn't tell whether it was fate or sheer recklessness that had brought them together, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let her face this alone. The stars outside the viewport stretched into long streaks as they entered hyperspace, the ship speeding toward the unknown. Elias knew the journey ahead would be fraught with danger. But there was a determination in him now, a resolve that matched the fire in Isara's eyes. The chase begins ***. The days that followed were quiet, almost unnervingly so. Elias and Isara fell into a routine. He piloted the ship while she kept to herself, spending hours in the ship's lower hold, meditating or training. Elias had no idea what kind of training she was undertaking, but the faint sounds of her movements, the occasional thump or scrape against the walls of the hold, hinted at a discipline he couldn't comprehend. Isara was no ordinary slave. She wasn't someone who had been broken into compliance. She had learned to survive, to fight, to navigate the darkness of a galaxy that didn't care. She was a weapon. Elias didn't ask questions. He knew better. Whatever Isara had been through, she wasn't ready to talk about it. And he wasn't about to push her. They were partners in a way, two people bound together by fate, but there was a vast gulf between them, one built on years of suffering and secrets he couldn't even begin to imagine. The calm, however, didn't last. It was 3 days into their journey when the first signs of trouble appeared. Elias was in the cockpit, running through a series of diagnostic checks, when a soft beep interrupted him. His eyes flicked to the ship's long-range scanner, a quiet hum of activity showing a ship emerging from hyperspace not far behind them. Elias' fingers froze over the controls. The ship wasn't big, not enough to be a warship, but it was fast, too fast to be a normal merchant vessel. His gut tightened. He didn't need to check the identification code. The vessel was a Idar warship, no mistaking it. He had known this moment would come. He had expected it. But now that it was happening, there was no time to second-guess his decision. Without thinking, Elias flipped a switch, and the ship's sensors immediately went into stealth mode. The noise from the engine dropped, and the ship became a near-invisible speck in the vastness of space. The Idar ship behind them would need to be close, very close, to detect their presence. Elias didn't hesitate. He throttled the ship forward, the engines roaring back to life, pushing the ship deeper into the black expanse. But even with the ship's reduced profile, the Idar vessel was relentless, matching their speed and distance with unnerving precision. Isara appeared in the doorway of the cockpit, her expression calm but her eyes sharp with a dangerous glint. She must have felt the shift in energy, the tension in the air. "You knew this would happen," she said, her voice flat, devoid of any surprise. Elias didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the screen, his fingers working swiftly over the controls as he adjusted their course. "I knew. But I wasn't expecting them to find us this quickly. They must have been tracking us from the moment we jumped into the system." "Then why haven't we left?" she asked. "Jump out. Now." Elias gritted his teeth. "We don't have the fuel to make another jump. Not yet. If I try to jump now, we'll end up dead in space. This ship can't handle it." Isara's gaze sharpened. "You're lying," she said, taking a step closer, her eyes piercing him. "You could have escaped. But you didn't." Elias met her eyes for the first time, the weight of his decisions hanging heavy between them. "I'm not lying. But we're not going to run. Not yet." Isara narrowed her eyes. She wasn't stupid, she knew exactly what Elias was doing. He was preparing them for a fight. "I'm not running either," she said, her voice hard. "You don't know the Idar like I do. If we run, they'll follow us until we're out of fuel, out of hope. The only chance we have is to fight." Elias felt a shiver of fear run through him. He had never been in a fight like this before, not against the Idar. They were brutal, unrelenting, and far too powerful for a simple smuggler like him. But something in Isara's tone made him believe it was possible. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. "All right," he said after a long pause. "We'll fight. But we need a plan." Isara smiled grimly, and for the first time since they had met, Elias saw something resembling pride in her eyes. She wasn't just a slave anymore. She was the leader of a rebellion, a force that couldn't be easily stopped. "I'll take care of the Idar ship," she said, moving toward the weapons locker. Elias shook his head, alarmed. "You're insane. I can't let you go out there alone. Bill. I don't need you to protect me," she snapped. "I didn't survive this long by letting anyone hold my hand." Before Elias could protest further, she was already loading a series of blasters and a small energy blade, her movements efficient and deadly. He watched, helpless, as she prepared herself for a battle that might very well kill them both. "You don't even know what you're up against," Elias said, stepping in front of her, his heart pounding. "The Idar have the entire system on lockdown. They'll bring down the whole fleet if they have to." Isara locked eyes with him, and for a moment, he saw the weight of the entire galaxy in her gaze. She had fought too long to be afraid now. "I'm not afraid of them. I'm afraid of nothing anymore." Elias stepped back, his mind racing. Isara had already made her choice. She had always been a fighter and no amount of pleading would change that. With a heavy sigh, Elias powered down the ship's engine, dropping them into a dead drift in the emptiness of space. The Adar ship was drawing closer, now within striking distance. It was time. Prepare yourself, Elias said quietly, not sure if he was speaking to Isara or to himself. The ship rumbled as Isara secured herself to the nearby bulkhead, her hand resting on the activation button for the weapons systems. She was ready. Elias wasn't. The Adar ship loomed large on the screen, a dark, looming shadow, almost predatory in its approach. Elias had no illusions about what was about to happen. They were outnumbered and outgunned. But they still had one advantage, the element of surprise. Now? Isara shouted. She hit the button, and the ship's defense systems came online, releasing a series of energy pulses. The Adar ship responded instantly, returning fire, but Elias had already thrown the ship into evasive maneuvers. They were caught in a dance of light and destruction, spinning through space, weapons clashing as Elias tried to outwit the Adar. Isara's eyes gleamed with fury as she moved to the comms system, sending a signal to their enemy. "I am not your property," she snarled into the microphone. "And you will never have me again." The Adar response was swift and cold. The blood of the betrayed ***. The Adar ship's response was immediate and brutal. Their weapons lashed out like the strike of a serpent, sending waves of energy that shook the smuggler ship's hull. The lights flickered as the shields flared up, struggling to hold against the bombardment. Elias gritted his teeth, hands white-knuckled on the controls, his eyes flicking between the evasive maneuvers and Isara, who was already in motion. "You can't outrun them," Elias shouted over the roar of the energy blast. "We need to get out of here now." But Isara didn't answer. She was too focused on the task at hand, her movements fluid and precise. She was setting up the ship's own weapons, targeting the Adar ship's weak points. Elias had no idea how she knew where to strike. He could barely keep the ship from falling apart. But she seemed to know exactly what she was doing, a mastery of combat honed by years of fighting, of surviving. "Hold them off," she called back to him, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We'll hit them where it hurts." Elias wanted to protest, to argue that they were outmatched. The Adar ship was huge, heavily armored, and packed with more firepower than he could fathom. There was no way they could win this fight. But he didn't have time for doubt. Instead, he gritted his teeth and focused, pulling the ship into a sharp dive, narrowly avoiding another round of plasma blasts. The Adar ship followed them relentlessly, a predatory force with no mercy. Elias knew they wouldn't stop until they either had Isara back, or until they destroyed everything in their path. "Damn it, Elias muttered as the Adar ship fired again, this time striking the smuggler ship's aft. A loud explosion rocked the hull, sending the ship spinning for a moment. The lights flickered and then went out completely, leaving them in a strobe of emergency red. "We're losing power," Elias shouted. "We need to jump now before—" "I said no," Isara's voice cut through the panic. She was already in motion, heading toward the rear of the ship. "We need to give them something to think about." Before Elias could protest, he heard a series of rapid footsteps as Isara moved to the weapons bay. She was carrying a series of explosive charges, simple but highly effective against the heavily armored Adar ship. "You can't just—" Elias started, but the words caught in his throat. He knew she wasn't asking for his approval. The ship jolted again, this time the Adar ship's cannons blasting right through the shields. Elias struggled to regain control of the ship, trying desperately to stay one step ahead of their relentless pursuers. "Elias?" Isara's voice rang out from the rear, sharp and commanding. "Get ready to hit their main reactor." "I've set the charges." Elias' stomach twisted. He wasn't an expert in starship combat, but he understood enough to know what Isara was about to do. She was going to sabotage the Adar ship. And she wasn't giving them a chance to escape. But there was one problem: she was going to destroy them both. He had no time to argue. As the ship careened wildly in the chaos of battle, he saw Isara's silhouette moving along the hull, planting explosives with deadly precision. A part of him screamed to stop her, to pull her back before it was too late, but another part of him understood. This was her life's fight. This was what she had been born to do. "We don't have much time," Isara called out. "Get the ship ready for a jump. I'll deal with the rest." Elias set his jaw, trying to push back the gnawing feeling in his gut. The reactor was their last chance, the Adar ship's most vulnerable point. If they could hit it, they might cripple the ship long enough to escape. But they didn't have much time. Not enough time to think, to process. The ship rumbled again and Elias knew they couldn't keep taking hits like this. The Adar ship was closing in. They were almost there. Hold on. Elias shouted as he yanked the controls hard, sending them into a sharp evasive roll. It worked barely. But the Adar weren't about to give up. A few moments later, another blast hit them, this one piercing the hull, sending sparks flying across the cockpit. Now Elias. Isara screamed from behind him. Without thinking, Elias slammed his hand on the controls, sending the ship's remaining power into the hyperdrive. The ship lurched forward, the stars stretching into bright streaks as the engine activated. For a split second they were weightless, lost in the transition to hyperspace, the staccato of explosions still echoing in their ears. But before the ship could complete its jump, a final blast shook them to their core. Isara's voice echoed through the comms, sharp and urgent. The charges are set. Get us out of here. Elias's mind raced. He knew they couldn't make it, there was no way they could. The Adar ship would chase them. But there was no time for doubt. And then the ship lurched once more. It was a gut-wrenching, heart-stopping sensation, like the universe had twisted itself inside out. And then, suddenly they were free. They were no longer in the Adar sector. The endless stretch of stars that had seemed so close was now a vast and empty sea, the quiet hum of the ship's engines their only company. Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, staring at the view screen as the chaos of battle faded into the distance. They had made it. But for how long? Elias's hands trembled on the controls as he looked at the damage. The hull was scorched and the ship's systems were barely holding together. They had only moments before they would need to land somewhere, anywhere, to make repairs. Isara appeared beside him, her face grim but resolute. She nodded at the screen. You did well. We're alive. For now. Elias met her gaze, but the weight of their survival pressed down on him. Isara, the charges, the reactor. Did we get them? She didn't answer right away. Her face was unreadable, the steel of her resolve never wavering. The Adar will never stop coming for me, she said, voice quiet, almost contemplative. But they'll have to rebuild. That will take time. And us? Elias asked, his voice rough. What about us? Isara glanced at him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't name. Something hard, something unyielding. We survive, she said. We fight. Beneath the surface ***. The hum of the ship's failing engines was the only sound that broke the eerie silence that followed their escape. The stars outside the viewport, distant and cold, seemed to mock their survival, offering no comfort in their isolation. The ship had made it, barely, fragments of metal still clung to the hull like scars from the battle they had just fought, and the interior was a mess of flickering lights and malfunctioning systems. But they were alive. For now. Isara didn't waste any time. As soon as the ship settled into what passed for a stable orbit, she was already moving through the corridors, pulling open panels and assessing the damage. Elias stood in the cockpit, his fingers hovering over the controls, unwilling to move until he was sure the immediate danger had passed. The quiet was oppressive, but it didn't last long. Soon, he heard the sharp clink of tools and the occasional hiss of steam escaping from ruptured pipes as Isara worked. Elias could feel the weight of her presence as she moved, her energy as palpable as the tension in the air. She was a warrior, a survivor, and she would not rest until they were ready for whatever came next. He leaned back in the cockpit chair, rubbing his eyes, trying to clear his mind. His thoughts kept drifting back to the fight with the Adar, to the explosions, to Isara's words as she had set the charges. We fight. It had been a declaration, not a question, a promise that had somehow etched itself into his soul. But what now? They had escaped, but for how long? The Adar wouldn't give up that easily. They would track them, they would hunt them. Elias knew it was only a matter of time before their enemies found them again. He had to admit something to himself. Despite his bravado, he wasn't prepared for the war that was now unfolding around them. He was just a smuggler, a man who had lived by his wits, evaded the authorities, made deals with criminals, and mostly stayed out of the way. But Isara wasn't just another person in his life. She was a force, a fire. And that fire burned in a way that both terrified and exhilarated him. The ship shuddered as Isara entered the cockpit, her face streaked with grime and sweat, but her eyes as sharp as ever. We're in the clear for now, she said, her voice steady, despite the chaos they'd just escaped. But we can't stay here long. I've done all I can to patch up the systems, but we're losing power. The reactor's been compromised. We need to find a place to repair the ship before it fails completely. Elias nodded, glancing at the console. The readings confirmed what Isara had said. The reactor was barely holding, and they had no choice but to find a repair station or a safe harbor. He could see her mind working, calculating their options. "We can head to Epsilon 7, he suggested. "It's a small moon in the outer rim. Not much traffic, and I know a guy who can get us what we need to fix the ship. But it's a rough place. We'll have to be careful." Isara's eyes flicked to the screen, studying the coordinates Elias had pulled up. She didn't say anything for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Epsilon 7, she repeated. "Fine. We'll go there. But don't think for a second that we're safe. Not until I say so." Elias didn't argue. He had learned early on to trust Isara's instincts, no matter how dangerous they seemed. She wasn't afraid to face the consequences of her actions, and that made her dangerous in ways he couldn't even fully understand. The days passed slowly, with the sound of the ship's engines the only constant. Isara remained as intense as ever, working on repairs, meditating, or sharpening her skills, but she rarely spoke. Elias did most of the talking, though it was clear she wasn't particularly interested in engaging with him beyond what was necessary. They didn't talk about the past, either of their pasts. Elias had his secrets and Isara had hers. He knew the basics of her story. The Adar had owned her, trained her, and then tried to break her. But there was so much more to her that he couldn't yet grasp. And he didn't ask. Some things didn't need to be spoken. The silence between them was comfortable in its own way, though Elias felt the tension between them constantly. It wasn't just the threat of the Adar, it was something else. Something unspoken. They arrived at Epsilon 7 just after the third day. The moon was small, with a barren surface that could barely support life. The settlement was little more than a hodgepodge of buildings thrown together by those who had nowhere else to go, a haven for outlaws, exiles, and those trying to disappear. The air was thin, and the atmosphere had a strange, otherworldly quality to it. It was a place of secrecy. A place where people kept their heads down and their voices low. Elias set the ship down on a rocky outcrop, far from the main settlement, so they wouldn't attract too much attention. Isara was already gathering her gear, preparing for whatever was waiting in the shadows of the settlement. She had a way of moving, a predatory grace that told Elias she was ready for anything. "We'll need to lay low," Elias warned, eyeing the distant lights of the settlement. "It's not a safe place for strangers, and I don't think we're going to be the only ones looking for work here." Isara turned to him, her gaze intense, unreadable. "You should be more concerned with the Adar. They'll be looking for me. They're more likely to find us here than anywhere else." Elias's heart skipped a beat. "You're not wrong," he admitted. "But we don't have much of a choice. This is the only place I know where we can get the parts we need." "Then we'll make it work," she said, turning toward the hatch. "Get the ship ready. I'll handle the rest." Elias opened his mouth to protest, but she was already gone, disappearing into the dim light of the planet's rocky surface. He watched her silhouette fade, a lone figure in the wasteland. He couldn't help but feel a strange pull, a sense of destiny threading itself into the dangerous game they were playing. This was it. There was no turning back. Elias closed the hatch behind him, locking the ship into place. The storm was coming and there was no way to outrun it. The underworld of Epsilon. The dust of Epsilon 7 clung to Elias' boots as he stepped off the ship and onto the barren ground. The moon's atmosphere was thin, and the wind carried a chill that seemed to cut right through him, but he barely felt it. He was too focused on the path ahead, too focused on Isara's presence and the uneasy feeling that hung in the air. The settlement sprawled in the distance, a collection of flickering lights and dark shapes in the distance. It was a hive of criminal activity, a place where no one asked questions. Elias knew it well enough from his previous dealings, but even so, he couldn't shake the sense of danger that seemed to pulse in the air. This wasn't a place for anyone with a conscience. And they weren't just anyone. Not anymore. "Stay low," Elias said to Isara, who was already a few paces ahead, her silhouette a stark contrast against the dim glow of the distant settlement. "We can't afford to draw attention. If the Adar are out there, they'll be looking for us." Isara didn't acknowledge him, but he didn't expect her to. She was a woman of few words, a woman whose every action spoke louder than anything she could say. Elias knew that look in her eyes. It was the same look she had when she set those charges in the Adar ship. It was the look of someone ready for war. The pair moved through the rocky terrain with purpose, keeping to the shadows and away from the main roads. They could hear the faint hum of engines and the distant voices of traders and mercenaries, but Elias kept his focus on the task at hand. They needed parts for the ship and they needed them fast. He knew exactly where to go, but the place he had in mind wasn't exactly welcoming to newcomers. As they neared the entrance to the settlement, a large, rusted gate loomed ahead. Elias gave a quick glance to Isara, who was already scanning the area with a practiced eye, as if she expected trouble to appear at any moment. "We'll head to the lower levels," Elias said, his voice low. "That's where the guy I know operates. He's got the parts we need, but he's a little hard to deal with. He's not exactly on the up and up." Isara nodded, her eyes unreadable, and followed him through the gate. The stench of oil, sweat, and cheap liquor hit them as soon as they entered the settlement. The air was thick with smoke from small fires, and the ground beneath their feet was slick with mud and discarded refuse. This was a place where survival was everything, where the weak were consumed by the harshness of the world, and the strong ruled by fear. Elias led them through narrow alleys, past groups of rough-looking individuals who eyed them with suspicion. Some of them were mercenaries, others were smugglers and thieves, but all of them had one thing in common: they weren't the type to ask questions. Isara, however, was the one drawing attention. Her every movement was deliberate, her posture radiating an aura of confidence and authority. Elias could feel the eyes on her, the unspoken acknowledgement of her strength. She had that effect on people, the kind of power that made even the hardest criminals hesitate before crossing her. And that, Elias realized, was something they needed right now. They reached a building at the far end of the settlement, its facade covered in layers of grime and rust. The sign above the door was faded, barely legible, but Elias recognized it immediately. "The Fixer," it read in old, worn lettering. It was a black market repair shop, a place where anything could be bought, if you had the right connections. Elias didn't hesitate. He pushed the door open, the old metal creaking in protest, and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, with shelves stacked high with scrap parts, tools, and various pieces of machinery. The air smelled of oil and metal, a scent that reminded Elias of countless other deals he had made in places like this. Behind the counter stood a squat, greasy man with a permanent scowl on his face. His eyes flicked up as they entered, and he immediately sized them up. Elias wasn't sure if he remembered him, but the man's expression didn't change. Well, the man muttered, wiping his hands on a rag. "What brings you to my humble shop, Elias? I didn't expect to see you again." Elias gave a tight smile. "I need parts. And I need them fast." The man snorted. "Don't we all? You're lucky you showed up when you did. Things are getting a little crowded around here. But you're going to pay for those parts, right?" Elias pulled out a small pouch of credits, tossing it on the counter. "This is more than enough." The man's eyes gleamed as he grabbed the pouch and gave it a quick shake. "I can make that work. But don't think for a second that I'm doing this out of the goodness of my heart. I'm not exactly running a charity here. Just give us what we need," Elias said, trying to keep his patience. The man wasn't the problem. The problem was what they had to do after the parts were secured. The Fixer grunted and gestured toward a shelf in the back of the shop. "Parts are in the back. Grab what you need. But make it quick. I've got a lot of business to tend to." Elias nodded and motioned for Isara to follow him. She didn't speak, but her eyes flicked to the various tools and gadgets that filled the shelves. There was a certain efficiency in the way she moved, a sharpness in the way she observed everything. Elias could tell she wasn't just looking for ship parts. She was scanning for anything that could be useful. As they sifted through the shelves, Elias felt the tension building again, that nagging sense that something was wrong. It was too quiet. The Fixer was too accommodating. And then he heard it, the faint hum of engines. The sound of a ship descending. It was far off, but it was enough to make Elias freeze. He glanced at Isara. Her eyes were already on him, her face unreadable, but there was something in the way she stood that told him she was ready for whatever was coming. "Get the parts," Elias whispered. "Hurry." They grabbed what they needed, quickly stuffing the necessary components into a bag. But as they turned to leave, the door slammed open with a violent crash, and a group of men entered, their faces covered by the shadow of their hoods. One of them stepped forward. "I think you've overstayed your welcome." The Reckoning ***. The door slammed shut behind them with a finality that sent a cold shiver down Elias' spine. He could hear the hum of engines in the distance, growing louder as if drawing closer. The group that had just entered wasn't just another set of smugglers or mercenaries. Elias recognized them immediately. The Adar. Their hulking figures loomed in the doorway, their dark silhouettes framed by the dim light filtering through the grimy windows. Their armor was distinctive, sleek, black, and intimidating, with angular designs that seemed to twist and shift in the low light. The air in the room seemed to pulse with their presence, and Elias could almost feel the heat radiating from their weapons. He stepped back instinctively, his hand reaching for the blaster at his side. But before he could move, Isara was already ahead of him. She had her own weapon drawn, a sleek, deadly-looking pistol, and she was scanning the room with a focus that sent a chill through him. Her body was tense, poised for action. "You're far from home," one of the Adar stepped forward, his voice a deep, guttural growl that vibrated in the air. His eyes locked on Isara, and Elias could see the way they narrowed with recognition. "You should have stayed hidden, little slave." Isara didn't flinch. Her gaze was cold, unyielding. "I don't hide." Elias felt the tension in the air tighten like a coiled spring. The Adar were no strangers to cruelty, and from the way they moved and spoke, it was clear they had no intention of letting Isara escape again. These weren't just bounty hunters. They were soldiers trained to hunt, capture, and destroy. The Adar leader, a massive, armored creature with a scar running down one side of his face, stepped closer, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. He was the one who had been overseeing Isara's capture all those years ago. The one who had made her life a living nightmare. And Elias could see the hatred in his eyes. It wasn't just about capturing a runaway slave. It was personal. "Give her to us," the leader growled, his voice low and threatening. "She belongs to the Adar. She always will." Elias felt a surge of anger, but he kept his cool. "She's not yours to take anymore," he said, his voice steady but with an edge. "She's free." The Adar leader laughed, a low, menacing sound. "Free? You think you can stand in our way? You're nothing but a speck of dust, human." Isara didn't speak, but the air around her seemed to shift. Elias could feel it, a weight, a power that surged from her. It wasn't just anger. It was something deeper, something primal. The years of suffering, of being hunted, of surviving against impossible odds, it all boiled down to this moment. "Get out of my way," Isara said, her voice quiet but carrying an undeniable authority. "Or I'll make you." The Adar leader grinned, but there was no humor in it. "You think you can fight us? We've crushed entire systems with less. You're no warrior, little slave. You're nothing." That was the breaking point. In an instant Isara moved, faster than Elias could track. Her gun was already up and firing before the Adar leader could react. The shot was precise, aimed at his exposed throat. But even as she fired, Elias could see the leader's massive hand moving to strike, his massive blade humming with deadly energy. Time seemed to slow as the two forces collided. Elias leaped into action, diving toward one of the Adar who had made the mistake of getting too close to him. His hand was already on the blaster, his fingers squeezing the trigger. The shot was clean and the Adar dropped, but Elias didn't have time to celebrate his luck. The other soldiers were already moving. Isara was engaged in a brutal dance with the leader. His armor was thick, but her aim was sharper, her movements fluid and calculated. Every strike, every counter, was a reminder of the hell she had endured, and of what she had become as a result. She wasn't just a slave anymore. She was a weapon, a force of nature, and the Adar would learn that the hard way. Elias didn't wait to watch the fight. He kept his head down and focused on the remaining Adar soldiers. Two more of them moved toward him, their weapons drawn. They were fast, but Elias had the advantage of desperation on his side. He shot the first one in the leg, the force of the blast sending the Adar soldier crashing into a pile of scrap. But the second one was already on him, moving like a shadow. Elias barely had time to react as the Adar swung its weapon at his head. He ducked just in time, the blade cutting through the air above him. He scrambled backward, reaching for his blaster, but the Adar was faster. The soldier lunged at him, its clawed hands aiming for his throat. Elias could hear his heart pounding in his ears as he struggled to maintain control. He pushed the Adar away, grabbing a nearby metal pipe and swinging it toward the soldier's head. The blow landed with a satisfying thud, but the Adar didn't go down. It staggered, but it was still alive. And it was angry. "Elias?" Isara's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "I need help." He looked toward her, his blood running cold. The Adar leader was still on his feet, his throat badly wounded but not dead. Isara was struggling to hold him off. His massive hand swung again, catching her off guard, sending her crashing into the wall. Elias didn't hesitate. He ran toward them, charging with everything he had. In a flash, he was at her side, firing his blaster at the Adar leader, trying to distract him long enough for Isara to regain her footing. The shots landed, but they didn't slow him down. The leader turned, swinging his blade in a deadly arc. Elias dived toward Isara, pulling her out of harm's way just in time. "You've got to finish this," he gasped, grabbing a blaster from his belt and handing it to her. "Now." Isara nodded, her face hard with determination. She didn't speak, but her eyes told him everything he needed to know. She was going to end this. With a roar, she charged the Adar leader, her blaster raised. She fired point blank, the energy blast hitting the leader square in the chest. But it wasn't enough. She could see it in his eyes, he was still standing. But then something changed. Isara's face went blank, her entire body stilling as she focused, her mind centering. She reached out with one hand, her palm facing the leader. A pulse of energy surged from her, not in the form of a weapon but in sheer force. The Adar leader staggered back, his body convulsing as if caught in an unseen storm. For a moment, Elias thought he was imagining it, but then the Adar leader fell to his knees, gasping for breath. Isara took a step forward, her face cold with fury. This asterisk is what you took from me, she whispered, and with one final burst of power, the Adar leader crumpled to the floor, motionless. Isara stood over him, panting, but her eyes were clear, her victory unspoken. Elias stepped back, awestruck by the raw force of her power. She had done it. She had taken down the most dangerous of them all. The rest of the Adar soldiers hesitated, their leader's fall shaking them. They weren't sure whether to flee or fight, but Elias didn't wait to find out. He opened fire, his blaster taking down the nearest one, the others scattering as they realized they were no match for the two of them. In the aftermath, the room fell silent, save for the distant sound of engines fading into the night. "We're not done yet," Isara said, her voice hoarse but resolute. Elias nodded, his chest tight with the weight of what they had just accomplished. Not by a long shot. But for the first time since they had met, Elias realized something. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more exciting HFY stories. Your support means the world to us. And make sure to tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for our next adventure, and until then, keep exploring the stars. See you in the next video.